I never thought using my own fireplace would land me in a legal battle that would expose an entire homeowners association for discriminatory practices. But here I am, sitting in my living room watching the evening news report on the largest Fair Housing Act fine in county history. My name is William Masterson, and I moved to Cedar Ridge Estates in Lakewood, Colorado, 3 years ago after my doctor diagnosed me with severe rheumatoid arthritis. At 42 years old, I had to accept that my body was changing, and I needed to make accommodations. The cold mountain air affected my joints terribly, and my physician recommended I find ways to maintain consistent warmth in my living space. When I purchased my 3-bedroom ranch house in this quiet subdivision, the real estate agent specifically mentioned the wood-burning fireplace as a selling point. Little did I know that using it would nearly destroy my life. The trouble started on a frigid January evening when temperatures dropped to 8 degrees Fahrenheit. My joints were aching something fierce, and the central heating system struggled to keep up with the cold. I decided to light a fire in my fireplace, something I had done occasionally throughout the previous 2 winters without incident. The warmth spreading through my living room provided immediate relief, and I settled into my armchair with a book, grateful for the comfort. 3 days later, I found a violation notice taped to my front door. The bright pink paper fluttered in the winter wind as I pulled it free, my stiff fingers fumbling with the edges. According to the notice, I had violated Cedar Ridge Estates HOA Covenant Section 7.3, which prohibited the use of wood-burning fireplaces between November 1st and March 31st due to air quality concerns. The fine was $250, and I had 10 days to respond. I stood on my porch reading that notice 3 times, convinced I had missed something during my home purchase. I had reviewed the HOA documents carefully before closing, specifically looking for any restrictions that might affect my medical needs. There had been nothing about fireplace restrictions. I immediately went inside and dug through my files, pulling out the thick folder of paperwork from the sale. I spent 2 hours combing through every page of the covenants, conditions, and restrictions. Section 7.3 discussed exterior modifications and landscaping requirements. There was absolutely nothing about fireplaces. The next morning, I called the HOA office and spoke with the property manager, a woman named Bethany, who sounded harried and distracted. She put me on hold for nearly 15 minutes before returning to tell me that President Sharon Whitmore would need to address my concerns. She gave me Sharon's email address and suggested I submit my questions in writing. I composed a detailed email explaining that I had reviewed my HOA documents and found no mention of fireplace restrictions. I attached scanned copies of my Section 7.3 pages and requested clarification. Sharon responded within an hour, her message curt and dismissive. She informed me that the fireplace restriction had been added to the covenants 18 months ago through a properly executed amendment, and all homeowners had been notified via email and posted notice. She expected payment of the fine within the specified time frame. That response sent me digging deeper. I searched every email from the HOA going back 3 years. There was nothing about a covenant amendment. I checked my spam folders, my archived messages, everything. Then I drove to the community center, where HOA notices were supposedly posted on a bulletin board near the mailboxes. Current notices advertised an upcoming spring social and reminded residents about trash collection schedules. I asked the woman working at the front desk about older notices, and she shrugged apologetically, explaining they only kept current items posted. I was not about to pay a fine for violating a rule. I had never been properly notified about, especially when that rule directly impacted my ability to manage a medical condition. I responded to Sharon explaining my situation, detailing my arthritis diagnosis and my doctor's recommendations for maintaining warmth. I requested copies of the supposed amendment notification and asked for a hearing to contest the fine. Sharon's next email arrived 2 days later, and her tone had shifted from dismissive to hostile. She wrote that medical conditions did not exempt anyone from HOA rules, that her own mother had arthritis and managed just fine without violating community standards, and that if I refused to pay the fine, it would increase to $500 and potentially result in a lien against my property. She included an attachment labeled Covenant Amendment 2024-03. I opened the document with growing frustration. The amendment was dated March 15th of the previous year, and indeed prohibited wood-burning fireplace use during winter months, citing concerns about smoke, air quality, and neighborhood aesthetics. At the bottom was a notice section claiming the amendment had been approved by a vote of the HOA board and distributed to all homeowners via email on March 20th, with physical copies available at the community center. The problem was, I had never received this email, and I had never seen a physical copy. Moreover, when I checked my own HOA governing documents, they clearly stated that covenant amendments required approval by a vote of at least 67% of homeowners, not just the board. I needed to know if this amendment had been properly ratified. I decided to take a walk through my neighborhood that weekend, knocking on doors and talking to my neighbors. I had kept mostly to myself since moving in, focused on managing my health and adjusting to early retirement on disability. Now I wished I had been more social. At the first house, an elderly couple named George and Rita listened to my story sympathetically. George mentioned they did not have a fireplace, so the rule had not affected them, but Rita vaguely remembered receiving some email from the HOA last year that she had deleted without reading. At the second house, I met Marcus Chen, a software engineer who worked from home. Marcus became animated when I mentioned the fireplace restriction. He had a fireplace too, and had received the same violation notice after using it in December. He had paid the fine immediately because he was in the middle of a major project deadline and could not deal with the stress. He was furious to learn that I had found no record of proper notification. As I continued down the street, I discovered 4 more homeowners who had fireplaces. 2 had never used them and were unaware of the restriction. 1, a single mother named Jennifer, had received a violation notice and was currently fighting it. The last, a retired veteran named Tom, told me he had also used his fireplace for medical reasons related to his service injuries. He had received a violation notice, but had written a letter to the HOA explaining his disability and requesting a reasonable accommodation. Sharon had denied his request outright. That conversation with Tom changed everything. He suggested I was dealing with a Fair Housing Act violation. The Fair Housing Act prohibits discrimination based on disability and requires housing providers, including HOAs, to make reasonable accommodations for disabled residents. Refusing to allow me to use my fireplace when it was medically necessary could constitute illegal discrimination. I spent that evening researching Fair Housing Act requirements and Colorado disability discrimination laws. The more I read, the more convinced I became that Sharon and the Cedar Ridge Estates HOA were violating federal law. A reasonable accommodation is a change in rules, policies, practices, or services that may be necessary for a person with a disability to use and enjoy a dwelling. Using my existing fireplace to manage a medical condition seemed to fit that definition perfectly. On Monday morning, I visited my rheumatologist, Dr. Patricia Morrison. I explained the situation and asked if she would provide a letter documenting my medical need for supplemental heating. Dr. Morrison was immediately supportive. She had been treating me for 3 years and understood how temperature regulation affected my condition. She printed a letter on her practice letterhead right there in her office, detailing my diagnosis, my symptoms, how cold temperatures exacerbated my joint pain and stiffness, and her medical recommendation that I maintain consistent warmth in my living environment. She specifically noted that supplemental heating sources like fireplaces could be beneficial for managing my symptoms. Armed with Dr. Morrison's letter, I drafted a formal request for reasonable accommodation under the Fair Housing Act. I explained my disability, provided the medical documentation, and requested permission to use my wood-burning fireplace as needed to manage my condition. I cited the relevant sections of the Fair Housing Act and noted that the HOA was legally required to engage in an interactive process to determine if the accommodation was reasonable. I sent this request via certified mail to both Sharon Whitmore and the HOA's property management company. The response came faster than I expected. 4 days later, I received a phone call from Sharon herself. Her voice was sharp and condescending, as she launched into a speech about how the HOA had rules for a reason, how her board would not be bullied by residents trying to use legal technicalities to avoid compliance, and how if everyone claimed a medical need to violate the rules, the entire community would descend into chaos. I tried to interject, to explain that this was not about technicalities, but about federal disability rights law. Sharon talked right over me. She informed me that the HOA board had reviewed my request and denied it. According to her, allowing me to use my fireplace would fundamentally alter the nature of the community and pose an undue burden. She claimed other residents had complained about smoke and particulate matter, and that my accommodation request was therefore unreasonable. I asked what complaints she was referring to. Sharon became evasive, saying she could not share specific resident communications, but assuring me that multiple concerns had been raised. I asked when these complaints had been filed. Sharon said they were ongoing. I asked if any complaints had been filed before I submitted my accommodation request. Sharon told me that was not relevant and that the board's decision was final. She expected me to pay the now $500 fine within 5 days, or the HOA would proceed with placing a lien on my property. I hung up feeling defeated and angry. Everything I had read indicated that the HOA was blatantly violating the Fair Housing Act, but Sharon seemed confident in her position. I wondered if I was missing something, if maybe there was some loophole that allowed HOAs to deny accommodations in situations like mine. That night, I called Tom, the veteran I had met during my neighborhood canvassing. We talked for over an hour about our respective situations. Tom had been dealing with the HOA for months over various issues and had developed a deep distrust of Sharon and her board. He mentioned that several other residents had complained about Sharon's authoritarian management style and suggested I attend the next HOA board meeting to raise my concerns publicly. The meeting was scheduled for the following Thursday at 7 in the evening at the community center. I spent the intervening days preparing. I made copies of all my documentation, Dr. Morrison's letter, my accommodation request, Sharon's denial, and the relevant Fair Housing Act provisions. I also researched Colorado HOA law and discovered that the covenant amendment process Sharon had claimed to follow required not just board approval but a vote of the membership. I drafted a brief presentation outlining my position and practiced delivering it calmly and professionally. Thursday evening arrived cold and clear. I drove to the community center with my folder of documents, my stomach churning with anxiety. Public speaking had never been my strength, and confronting Sharon in front of the entire board felt intimidating. The meeting room was smaller than I expected, with about 30 folding chairs arranged in rows facing a long table where the 5 board members sat. Sharon occupied the center seat, a woman in her late 50s with severely styled blonde hair and a navy blue pantsuit that screamed corporate authority. The other board members looked less imposing. A middle-aged man in a polo shirt who kept checking his phone, 2 women who appeared to be in their 60s chatting quietly, and a younger man in business casual attire reviewing a stack of papers. About 15 residents had shown up for the meeting. I recognized Marcus and Jennifer from my door-knocking expedition. Tom arrived just as Sharon called the meeting to order, giving me an encouraging nod as he took a seat in the back row. Sharon moved through the agenda with brisk efficiency. There were discussions about landscape maintenance contracts, updates on community pool repairs, and a debate about holiday decoration guidelines. I waded through 40 minutes of minutiae, my heart pounding harder with each passing agenda item. Finally, Sharon reached homeowner comments and concerns. I raised my hand. Sharon's eyes fixed on me with obvious recognition and displeasure. She called on me with barely concealed irritation, instructing me to state my name and address for the record. I stood, my joints protesting the movement, and introduced myself. I explained that I was present to discuss the violation notice I had received for using my fireplace and the HOA's denial of my reasonable accommodation request. I summarized my medical condition, Dr. Morrison's recommendations, and my belief that the HOA was violating the Fair Housing Act. Before I could continue, Sharon interrupted. Her voice was cold and dismissive, as she informed me that individual violation disputes were not appropriate topics for board meetings, that I needed to follow the proper appeals process, and that I should sit down so the meeting could proceed. I remained standing. I explained that I had followed the proper process, that my accommodation request had been denied without the required interactive process, and that I was now requesting the board reconsider its decision in light of federal law. Several other residents murmured in support. Sharon's face flushed with anger. She declared that the board had consulted with legal counsel and was confident in its position. The fireplace restriction was a legitimate policy designed to protect community health and property values. Granting exceptions would create enforcement difficulties and set a dangerous precedent. My request was denied. The decision was final, and if I continued to violate the covenant, the HOA would pursue all available remedies, including legal action. Marcus stood up from his seat. He pointed out that he had never received proper notice of the covenant amendment and questioned whether it had been lawfully adopted. One of the older women on the board, who I later learned was named Helen, shifted uncomfortably and glanced at Sharon. Sharon dismissed Marcus's concern with a wave of her hand. She insisted that proper notice had been provided and that the amendment was valid. If residents failed to read their emails, that was not the HOA's problem. Tom stood next, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to command. He stated that he too had requested a reasonable accommodation for disability-related reasons and had been denied. He suggested that the HOA was engaging in a pattern of disability discrimination, and that residents should consider filing complaints with the Department of Housing and Urban Development. The room erupted in conversation. Several residents began talking at once, some supporting Sharon, others questioning the board's decisions. Sharon banged a gavel and demanded order. She declared that the meeting was not a forum for residents to attack the board or spread misinformation about legal compliance. She moved to adjourn. The motion was quickly seconded by the man with the phone, and despite protests from several residents, the meeting ended. I left the community center feeling even more frustrated than before. Sharon had made it clear that she had no intention of reconsidering her position. I needed help from someone with legal expertise. The next morning, I began searching for an attorney who specialized in Fair Housing Act cases. After several calls and consultations, I connected with a civil rights lawyer named David Hartman, whose practice focused on disability discrimination. David's office was in downtown Denver, about a 40-minute drive from my house. I made an appointment for the following Tuesday. David was younger than I expected, probably in his mid-30s, with an easy manner that put me at ease immediately. I spent 90 minutes in his office walking through the entire situation, providing copies of all my documents. David listened carefully, taking notes and asking clarifying questions. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and told me I had a strong case. According to David, the HOA had violated the Fair Housing Act in multiple ways. First, they had failed to engage in the required interactive process when I requested an accommodation. Instead of discussing alternatives or seeking additional information, Sharon had simply denied my request based on vague claims about fundamental alteration and undue burden. Second, the reasons Sharon had given for the denial did not meet the legal standard. Allowing me to use my existing fireplace for medical purposes would not fundamentally alter the nature of the community, and the HOA had provided no evidence of actual undue burden. Third, if the complaints about smoke and particulates Sharon had mentioned were fabricated or filed only after I requested accommodation, that could constitute retaliation, which was also illegal. David recommended we file a complaint with HUD and simultaneously send a demand letter to the HOA. The demand letter would outline the Fair Housing Act violations, demand that my accommodation request be granted, and request that the violation fines be rescinded. If the HOA refused to comply, we could pursue litigation. I authorized David to proceed. He drafted a comprehensive complaint to HUD detailing the discrimination I had experienced and documenting the HOA's failure to comply with federal law. He also prepared a detailed demand letter that methodically dismantled Sharon's justifications for denying my accommodation request. The letter gave the HOA 14 days to respond. While we waited for responses, my situation deteriorated. 2 weeks after the board meeting, I received a notice that the HOA had placed a lien on my property for unpaid fines totaling $750. The original $250 fine had apparently increased to $500 due to my failure to pay within 10 days, and the HOA had added another $250 in administrative fees and interest. I forwarded the lien notice to David immediately. He was outraged. He explained that placing a lien while a reasonable accommodation dispute was pending could constitute additional retaliation. He filed a motion in county court to have the lien removed, arguing that the underlying fines were the result of illegal discrimination. The situation escalated further when I received a cease and desist letter from the HOA's attorney. a lawyer named Richard Pembroke, whose letterhead listed him as specializing in community association law. Richard's letter accused me of harassing the HOA board, spreading false information about Fair Housing Act violations, and encouraging other residents to file frivolous complaints. The letter demanded I cease all communication with board members and other residents regarding HOA matters, or face legal action for defamation and tortious interference. David read Richard's letter with barely suppressed amusement. He called it a classic intimidation tactic designed to silence complainants. He assured me the letter had no legal merit and drafted a response that politely but firmly informed Richard that I was exercising my legal rights, that my Fair Housing Act complaint was well-founded, and that any attempt to retaliate against me for filing a complaint would result in additional legal action. March arrived with slowly warming temperatures and no resolution. Then, 6 weeks after I filed my HUD complaint, I received notice that HUD had accepted my case for investigation. A HUD investigator named Janet Reeves was assigned to my complaint. Janet contacted me by phone to schedule an interview and requested additional documentation. I met with Janet at a HUD office in Denver on a rainy afternoon. She was a thorough professional who spent 3 hours reviewing my case, asking detailed questions about the timeline of events, the HOA's responses, and the impact the situation had on my daily life. I provided everything I had: emails, letters, medical documentation, copies of the covenant materials, records of my door-to-door conversations with neighbors, and notes from the board meeting. Janet explained that HUD would investigate whether there was reasonable cause to believe the Fair Housing Act had been violated. She would interview Sharon and the board members, review HOA records, and attempt to determine if the amendment process had been properly followed, and if my accommodation request had been lawfully denied. The investigation could take several months. During this waiting period, I continued to use my fireplace when medically necessary. David had advised me that I had a right to use the accommodation I had requested while the legal process unfolded, especially since the HOA's denial appeared to violate federal law. I documented each use carefully, noting the date, the temperature, my symptom levels, and any interactions with the HOA. The HOA responded with increasing aggression. I received 3 more violation notices, each with escalating fines. Sharon sent multiple emails threatening legal action. At one point, a man who identified himself as a private investigator showed up at my door, claiming he was investigating improper fireplace use on behalf of the HOA. I refused to speak with him and reported the incident to both David and Janet. In early April, Janet interviewed Sharon and the board members. She also interviewed several of my neighbors, including Marcus, Tom, and Jennifer. I did not know exactly what was said in those interviews, but Janet indicated that she was finding significant discrepancies in the HOA's account of events. The breakthrough came in mid-May. Janet called to inform me that her investigation had uncovered serious problems with the HOA's conduct. First, the covenant amendment restricting fireplace use had never been properly ratified. The HOA's governing documents required a membership vote for covenant changes, but Sharon had simply had the board approve the amendment and claimed it was valid. Only about 15% of homeowners had even been notified, and no membership vote had occurred. The amendment was legally invalid. Second, Janet had found no evidence of resident complaints about smoke or particulates prior to my accommodation request. Sharon had claimed that multiple concerns had been raised, but the HOA's own records contained no such complaints. Janet had interviewed Sharon's alleged complainants, and several had stated they had never complained about my fireplace use. In fact, some had not even known I was using my fireplace. Sharon appeared to have fabricated the complaints to justify denying my accommodation. Third, the HOA had violated Fair Housing Act requirements by failing to engage in any interactive process with me. Sharon had denied my request immediately without seeking additional information, discussing alternatives, or attempting to find a solution that would address both my medical needs and the HOA's stated concerns. Based on these findings, HUD had determined there was reasonable cause to believe that Cedar Ridge Estates HOA had violated the Fair Housing Act by refusing to provide a reasonable accommodation for my disability, and by retaliating against me for asserting my rights. Janet was issuing a formal charge of discrimination. I felt vindicated but also anxious about what would come next. David explained that HUD's charge would give us significant leverage. The HOA could choose to settle through HUD's conciliation process, or the case could proceed to a hearing before an administrative law judge. If the HOA lost at hearing, they could face substantial fines and be ordered to pay damages to me. Sharon, predictably, refused to settle. Through her attorney Richard, she maintained that the HOA had done nothing wrong and that HUD was overreaching. She characterized me as a difficult resident trying to game the system and insisted the HOA would fight the charges. By late June, the case was scheduled for an administrative hearing. David began preparing in earnest, gathering evidence, lining up witnesses, and developing our presentation. He subpoenaed HOA records, including board meeting minutes, financial documents, and all communications related to the covenant amendment and my accommodation request. The subpoenaed documents revealed even more problems. Board meeting minutes showed that Sharon had pushed through the fireplace restriction over objections from Helen, the older board member who had looked uncomfortable during the meeting I attended. Helen had questioned whether the restriction was necessary and whether it might create legal issues, but Sharon had dismissed her concerns. The minutes also showed that the board had not conducted any environmental study or air quality assessment to justify the restriction. Sharon had simply decided she did not like seeing smoke from chimneys and wanted it stopped. Financial records raised additional red flags. The HOA had spent over $15,000 in legal fees fighting my accommodation request and the HUD investigation. This money had come from the community's reserve fund, which was supposed to be used for infrastructure maintenance and emergencies, not for Sharon's personal crusade against a disabled resident. David deposed Sharon, and the transcript made for remarkable reading. Under questioning, Sharon contradicted herself multiple times, could not provide evidence to support her claims about resident complaints, and became defensive and hostile when asked about her refusal to grant my accommodation. At one point, she stated that people with disabilities need to understand they cannot just demand special treatment, a statement that would prove devastating to her case. The administrative hearing was scheduled for mid-August at a federal building in Denver. As the date approached, settlement discussions resumed. HUD strongly encouraged the HOA to resolve the case through conciliation, warning that the evidence against them was substantial, and that proceeding to hearing could result in significant penalties. The week before the hearing, Richard contacted David to discuss settlement terms. The HOA was finally willing to acknowledge that mistakes had been made. After several rounds of negotiations, a settlement framework emerged. The HOA would rescind the invalid covenant amendment, grant my reasonable accommodation, remove the lien from my property, refund all fines I had been assessed, pay me $25,000 in damages for emotional distress and violation of my rights, pay my attorney's fees and costs, and implement Fair Housing Act training for all board members. I was inclined to accept the settlement. The fight had been exhausting both physically and emotionally. My arthritis had flared badly from the stress, and I just wanted to live peacefully in my home. David, however, advised caution. He pointed out that the settlement did not include any accountability for Sharon personally, nor did it prevent her from continuing to serve on the board and potentially discriminating against other residents in the future. We went back to Richard with additional terms. We wanted Sharon removed from the board, a formal policy implementing Fair Housing Act compliance procedures, and an increased damage payment of $50,000 to reflect the severity of the HOA's misconduct. Richard said the HOA would not agree to remove Sharon, as that was a decision for the membership. He offered $40,000 in damages and agreed to the policy implementation. I consulted with Tom and Marcus, both of whom had been following the case closely. Tom urged me to hold firm on Sharon's removal. He argued that as long as she remained in power, she would continue to abuse her position. Marcus agreed, but was more pragmatic, suggesting that exposure of Sharon's conduct might lead to her removal through community pressure even if it was not mandated by the settlement. Ultimately, I decided to reject the settlement offer and proceed to the hearing. David supported my decision. He believed we had an exceptionally strong case, and that a formal finding of discrimination by an administrative law judge would have more impact than a settlement that allowed the HOA to avoid admitting wrongdoing. The hearing took place over 3 days in a formal hearing room with wood paneling, and the seal of the Department of Housing and Urban Development prominently displayed. Administrative Law Judge Patricia Chen presided, a sharp-eyed woman in her 50s who made it clear from her opening remarks that she expected professionalism and adherence to evidence-based arguments. David presented our case methodically. He walked through the timeline of events, introduced my medical records and Dr. Morrison's testimony about my condition and treatment needs, presented evidence of the HOA's invalid covenant amendment, and demonstrated that Sharon had fabricated complaints to justify denying my accommodation request. He called several of my neighbors as witnesses who testified they had never complained about my fireplace use and had not been properly notified of the covenant amendment. Marcus testified about his own violation notice and fine. Tom testified about his accommodation request being denied. Dr. Morrison was an excellent witness. She explained rheumatoid arthritis in clear terms, described how temperature regulation affected my symptoms, and firmly stated that use of supplemental heating like a fireplace was a reasonable and medically appropriate way to manage my condition. Under cross-examination by Richard, she calmly rebutted his suggestions that I was exaggerating my symptoms or that alternative heating methods would be equally effective. The most dramatic moment came when David called Sharon to testify. She took the stand defensively, her posture rigid and her expression hostile. David began with basic questions about her role as HOA president and her involvement in the fireplace restriction. Sharon's answers were clipped and evasive. When David asked about the covenant amendment process, Sharon insisted everything had been done properly, despite documentary evidence to the contrary. When confronted with board meeting minutes showing that no membership vote had occurred, Sharon argued that the board had authority to make reasonable policy changes without membership approval. David then turned to my accommodation request. He asked Sharon to explain why she had denied it. Sharon launched into a speech about community standards, property values, and the importance of rules. David interrupted to ask specifically about the complaints she had cited as justification for the denial. Sharon hesitated, then claimed she could not remember specific details, but was certain complaints had been filed. David introduced HOA records showing no complaints about my fireplace use prior to my accommodation request. He then played video depositions from 3 residents Sharon had named as complainants, each stating they had never complained about my fireplace. Sharon's face went red. She insisted those residents must have forgotten or were not being truthful. Judge Chen intervened at that point, instructing Sharon to answer questions directly without speculation. David asked Sharon why, if air quality was truly a concern, the HOA had not conducted any environmental assessment or consulted with experts before implementing the fireplace restriction. Sharon had no good answer. He asked why she had refused to engage in any interactive process with me to explore possible accommodations. Sharon said there was nothing to discuss because the rule was clear. Finally, David asked Sharon about her statement during her deposition that people with disabilities need to understand they cannot just demand special treatment. Sharon tried to backtrack, claiming her words had been taken out of context, but David read the full passage from the transcript. In context, it was even worse. Sharon had gone on to say that accommodating every medical claim would make it impossible to enforce any rules, and that some people needed to accept they had chosen to live in a community with standards. Richard's defense was weak. He tried to argue that the HOA had legitimate reasons for the fireplace restriction, and that granting my accommodation would impose an undue burden by requiring the HOA to make exceptions to its rules and creating enforcement difficulties. Judge Chen pressed him on the undue burden claim, pointing out that the burden of allowing me to use my existing fireplace appeared to be minimal. Richard argued that other residents might also request fireplace accommodations, creating a slippery slope. Judge Chen noted that each accommodation request had to be evaluated individually, and that fear of future requests was not a valid reason to deny a current request. Richard called only 2 witnesses, a board member who testified that Sharon had assured the board the covenant amendment was proper, and an environmental consultant who provided general testimony about wood smoke and air quality. Under David's cross-examination, the board member admitted he had not actually reviewed the HOA's governing documents to verify whether the amendment process was correct, and the environmental consultant acknowledged he had never been asked to assess air quality in Cedar Ridge estates specifically, and had no data about whether my fireplace use was causing any actual problems. Closing arguments took place on the 3rd day. David argued that the evidence overwhelmingly demonstrated the HOA had violated the Fair Housing Act by refusing to provide a reasonable accommodation for my disability, by fabricating justifications for that refusal, and by retaliating against me when I asserted my rights. He asked Judge Chen to find discrimination had occurred, to order the HOA to grant my accommodation and implement policies to prevent future violations, and to impose substantial penalties to deter similar conduct by other HOAs. Richard argued that the HOA had acted in good faith based on legitimate community concerns, that any procedural errors were inadvertent, and that the situation had been blown out of proportion by an uncooperative resident. His argument fell flat in the face of the evidence. Judge Chen took the case under advisement and indicated she would issue a written decision within 60 days. The waiting period was agonizing. I tried to return to some semblance of normal life, but the case consumed my thoughts. David remained optimistic, telling me the hearing had gone as well as we could have hoped. The decision arrived on a Thursday morning in early October, a thick envelope from the Department of Housing and Urban Development. My hands shook as I opened it. The decision ran to 47 pages, but the conclusion was clear. Judge Chen had found that Cedar Ridge Estates HOA had violated the Fair Housing Act by refusing to grant me a reasonable accommodation for my disability, and by retaliating against me for requesting the accommodation. Judge Chen's decision methodically dismantled every argument the HOA had made. She found that I had sufficiently documented my disability and the medical necessity for supplemental heating. She found that my request to use my existing fireplace was eminently reasonable and would not impose any meaningful burden on the HOA. She found that the covenant amendment restricting fireplace use was invalid because it had not been properly adopted according to the HOA's governing documents. She found that Sharon had fabricated complaints about my fireplace use to justify denying my accommodation. And she found that the HOA's escalating fines, the lien on my property, and the cease and desist letter constituted retaliation. The remedy portion of the decision was everything I had hoped for. Judge Chen ordered the HOA to immediately grant my accommodation request and allow me to use my fireplace as needed for medical purposes. She ordered the HOA to remove the lien from my property and refund all fines with interest. She ordered the HOA to pay me $60,000 in damages for emotional distress and violation of my civil rights. She ordered the HOA to pay my attorney's fees and costs, which totaled approximately $38,000. She ordered the HOA to implement Comprehensive Fair Housing Act training for all board members within 90 days, and to adopt written policies for handling accommodation requests. But Judge Chen went further. She imposed a civil penalty of $75,000 payable to the United States government, finding that the HOA's conduct was egregious and that a substantial penalty was necessary to vindicate the public interest in Fair Housing Act compliance. She noted that Sharon's attitude toward disability accommodation, as reflected in her testimony and statements, demonstrated a concerning disregard for federal civil rights law. I sat in my living room reading that decision 3 times, hardly believing it was real. After months of stress and conflict, I had been vindicated completely. David called within an hour, having received his own copy of the decision. He was elated. He told me Judge Chen's decision was one of the strongest Fair Housing Act rulings he had seen in years, and would likely be cited in future cases. The decision sent shockwaves through Cedar Ridge Estates. News spread quickly, and suddenly neighbors who had barely acknowledged me were stopping by to express support. Several told me they had been afraid to speak up during the conflict because they feared becoming Sharon's next target. The HOA had 30 days to appeal Judge Chen's decision, but Richard advised the board that an appeal would almost certainly fail and would only result in additional legal fees. Reluctantly, the board voted to accept the decision and comply with its terms. The financial impact on the HOA was severe. Between the damages owed to me, the civil penalty, my attorney's fees, and the HOA's own legal costs, the total exceeded $200,000. The reserve fund was depleted, and the HOA had to implement a special assessment of $800 per household to cover the shortfall. Homeowners were furious, and blame fell squarely on Sharon. An emergency membership meeting was called for late October. The community center was packed, with over 100 residents in attendance. The mood was angry and confrontational. Homeowner after homeowner stood to express outrage at Sharon's handling of my case and the financial disaster it had created for the community. Several residents who had previously supported Sharon's strict enforcement approach now denounced her, arguing that common sense and compassion should have prevented the situation from escalating. Sharon attempted to defend herself, arguing she had been trying to protect community standards and had relied on legal advice. The membership was not sympathetic. A motion was made to remove Sharon from the board for cause. The vote was overwhelming, 93% in favor of removal. Helen, the board member who had expressed concerns about Sharon's approach, was elected interim president. She approached me at the end of the meeting to apologize for not speaking up more forcefully earlier. She admitted she had been intimidated by Sharon and had convinced herself that Sharon must know what she was doing. I appreciated her honesty and told her I hoped the community could move forward positively. With Sharon gone and new leadership in place, the atmosphere in Cedar Ridge Estates changed dramatically. Helen implemented the Fair Housing Act training Judge Chen had ordered, bringing in a civil rights attorney to educate the board about disability accommodation requirements. The board adopted clear policies for handling accommodation requests, including timelines for response, requirements for interactive dialogue, and guidelines for determining what constitutes an undue burden. The HOA formally rescinded the invalid fireplace covenant amendment at a membership meeting in November. Helen apologized publicly for the way I had been treated and expressed hope that I would continue to be a valued member of the community. The apology meant more to me than I expected. My life slowly returned to normal. I continued to use my fireplace as needed to manage my arthritis symptoms, without fear of violation notices or harassment. The damage check from the HOA allowed me to make some modifications to my home to better accommodate my disability, including installing heated floors in my bathroom and upgrading my insulation. Tom and I became friends through the ordeal. We started meeting for coffee regularly, and he introduced me to other veterans in the area dealing with disability issues. I found myself becoming something of an accidental advocate, sharing my story with other HOA residents facing discrimination and connecting them with resources. Marcus moved out of Cedar Ridge Estates the following spring, having grown disillusioned with HOA living in general. He told me before he left that watching my fight had inspired him to stand up for himself in other areas of his life. I was sorry to see him go, but understood his decision. Jennifer, the single mother who had also been fighting a violation notice, reached out to thank me. She said my case had given her the courage to push back against the HOA's unreasonable demands, and with Sharon gone, the new board had worked with her to resolve her issues cooperatively. In December, almost a year after that first violation notice appeared on my door, the local newspaper ran a feature story about my case. The article highlighted the importance of Fair Housing Act protections and warned HOAs about the dangers of failing to accommodate residents with disabilities. David was quoted extensively, emphasizing that reasonable accommodation is not special treatment, but equal access. The article caught the attention of a Colorado state legislator who was concerned about HOA abuse issues. She contacted me to discuss possible legislation to strengthen oversight of HOAs and ensure they comply with fair housing laws. I met with her in January and shared my experiences. While I could not claim credit for it, a bill was introduced that spring requiring all HOA board members in Colorado to complete fair housing training and establishing clearer procedures for residents to challenge HOA actions. Sharon largely disappeared from community life after her removal. I occasionally saw her at the grocery store or around town, but we never spoke. I heard through the neighborhood grapevine that she had moved out of Cedar Ridge Estates several months after losing her position, unable to face the neighbors who had voted to remove her. The civil penalty Judge Chen imposed made news beyond our community. $75,000 was one of the largest Fair Housing Act penalties ever assessed against a homeowners association in Colorado. HUD issued a press release about the case, using it as an example of disability discrimination, and emphasizing that HOAs must comply with federal fair housing laws just like any other housing provider. David told me he had been contacted by several other attorneys representing clients in similar situations, all citing my case as precedent. For me, the most significant outcome was not the money or the legal precedent, but the simple fact that I could live peacefully in my own home. On cold winter evenings, I light a fire in my fireplace without fear. The warmth eases my aching joints, and I sit in my armchair reading or watching television, grateful for the comfort and for the long fight that secured my right to it. The case taught me important lessons about standing up for yourself, even when authorities insist you are wrong. It taught me about the power of federal civil rights laws to protect vulnerable people from discrimination. And it taught me that communities function best when they balance legitimate rules with compassion and flexibility for individual needs. Helen proved to be an excellent HOA president. She focused on maintaining the community while respecting residents' rights and autonomy. Under her leadership, Cedar Ridge Estates became a more welcoming place. The hostile, authoritarian atmosphere Sharon had created dissipated, replaced by a sense of cooperation and mutual respect. 2 years after Judge Chen's decision, I reflected on how much had changed. My health had stabilized with proper management of my arthritis, including the regular use of my fireplace during cold weather. I had developed genuine friendships within the community, and I had found purpose in advocating for disability rights and fair housing, speaking at homeowner meetings around the state, and consulting with residents facing similar issues. The $60,000 in damages, combined with the attorney's fees the HOA was ordered to pay, sent a clear message. Discriminating against disabled residents is not just wrong, it is expensive. Other HOAs in Colorado took notice. David told me he had seen a marked increase in HOAs granting reasonable accommodations and taking disability rights seriously after my case. The story had a postscript that provided additional satisfaction. About 18 months after the decision, I received a letter from HUD informing me that Sharon had applied to serve on the board of a different HOA in a neighboring community. That HOA had contacted HUD for information as part of a background check. Based on the findings in my case, HUD had provided information about Sharon's discriminatory conduct and the violations she had committed. The other HOA decided not to allow her to serve on their board. While I felt a twinge of sympathy for Sharon's continued consequences, I also believed that HOA leadership positions should be held by people who understand and respect residents' civil rights. I never thought using my fireplace would lead to a legal battle that would fundamentally change how HOAs in Colorado handled disability accommodations. But life takes unexpected turns, and sometimes standing up for your rights means fighting battles you never wanted. The key is recognizing when something is worth fighting for, and having the courage to see it through. As I sit in my living room on this cold January evening, a fire crackling in my fireplace and my joints mercifully free of pain, I feel grateful for the outcome and proud that my case will help protect other disabled residents from the kind of discrimination I experienced. Sharon tried to use HOA rules as a weapon to punish me for having a disability. Instead, she learned that federal civil rights laws are more powerful than any covenant restriction, and that attempting to discriminate against disabled residents will result in serious legal and financial consequences. The Fair Housing Act exists precisely to prevent situations like mine, where housing providers deny reasonable accommodations based on prejudice, misunderstanding, or simple unwillingness to show flexibility. Judge Chen's decision reinforced that HOAs cannot hide behind community standards or aesthetic concerns when those standards violate fundamental civil rights. My victory was not just personal. It was a victory for every disabled person who needs accommodations to live comfortably in their home, and for every resident who faces an overreaching HOA board that believes its authority is unlimited. Helen continued to lead Cedar Ridge Estates with wisdom and fairness, and the community thrived under her guidance. The special assessment to pay for Sharon's legal disaster was painful for everyone, but it served as a powerful reminder of why leadership matters and why HOA boards must act responsibly. Several board members told me they now thought carefully about every decision, asking themselves whether their actions could withstand legal scrutiny and whether they were treating residents fairly. My relationship with my neighbors improved dramatically after the case concluded. People who had kept their distance during the conflict now greeted me warmly. Some apologized for not supporting me more actively during my fight with Sharon. I bore no grudges. I understood that most people want to avoid conflict, and that challenging an authoritarian HOA president takes courage that not everyone possesses. The training Helen implemented for the board made a real difference. Board members learned about their obligations under fair housing law, how to recognize when an accommodation request is reasonable, and how to engage in the interactive process that is required when evaluating such requests. The new policies adopted by the HOA ensured that future accommodation requests would be handled properly, with clear timelines, documentation requirements, and appeal procedures. I occasionally wonder what would have happened if I had simply paid that first $250 fine instead of fighting. I would have avoided months of stress and conflict. But I also would have surrendered my right to use my fireplace, my health would have suffered, and Sharon would have continued to discriminate against disabled residents with impunity. The fight was necessary, and the outcome justified the struggle. David and I stayed in touch after the case concluded. He occasionally consulted me when he had other Fair Housing Act cases, valuing my perspective as someone who had lived through the discrimination process. I was always happy to help, hoping that sharing my experience might make things easier for others facing similar situations. The case had unexpected professional benefits for David as well. The strong decision and substantial recovery made him sought after by plaintiffs in fair housing cases. He built a thriving practice representing individuals discriminating against by housing providers, and he told me my case was the foundation of that success. I was glad something positive had come from my ordeal. Looking back, I recognized that Sharon was not an evil person, just someone who became so invested in control and enforcement that she lost sight of basic human decency and legal requirements. Her downfall was self-inflicted, the result of her refusal to show flexibility, her willingness to fabricate evidence, and her fundamental disrespect for disability rights. Had she simply granted my reasonable accommodation request when I first made it, none of the subsequent disaster would have occurred. The $75,000 civil penalty Judge Chen imposed was significant not just in amount, but in what it represented. The penalty was paid to the federal government, not to me, and its purpose was to vindicate the public interest in fair housing law compliance. Judge Chen's message was clear. Disability discrimination is a serious violation that will be punished seriously. The penalty amount reflected the egregiousness of Sharon's conduct and the need to deter other HOAs from similar behavior. 3 years after that first violation notice appeared on my door, life in Cedar Ridge Estates was peaceful and pleasant. My health remained stable, my relationship with the community was positive, and I had found meaningful purpose in advocacy work. The nightmare of fighting Sharon and the HOA had receded into memory, though the lessons learned remained fresh. I share my story whenever I speak to homeowner groups or disability rights organizations, always emphasizing the same key points. Know your rights under the Fair Housing Act. Document everything. Do not be intimidated by housing providers who claim their rules are absolute, and seek legal help when facing discrimination. I also emphasize the importance of medical documentation when requesting accommodations, and the value of having an attorney who specializes in fair housing law. The financial recovery I received, while welcome, was never the primary goal. What mattered most was the right to live in my home without discrimination, the validation that my civil rights had been violated, and the knowledge that the system worked. Judge Chen's decision affirmed that disabled people have the right to reasonable accommodations, and that housing providers who refuse such accommodations face serious consequences. Sharon's behavior had been particularly egregious because she had not simply denied my accommodation request, but had actively retaliated against me for asserting my rights. The escalating fines, the property lien, the cease and desist letter, and the private investigator were all designed to punish and intimidate me. Judge Chen recognized this retaliation as a separate violation and factored it into both the damages award and the civil penalty. The case also highlighted the importance of proper HOA governance. Sharon's ability to push through an invalid covenant amendment and to spend thousands of dollars fighting my accommodation request without meaningful board oversight demonstrated serious governance failures. The board members who rubber-stamped Sharon's decisions without questioning her or reviewing the relevant law shared responsibility for the disaster that resulted. Helen's approach, emphasizing transparency, consultation, and respect for residents' rights, showed how HOAs should operate. As I approach the 4-year anniversary of the beginning of this saga, I remain grateful for the outcome and proud of my decision to fight. The case changed my life in ways beyond the immediate victory. It connected me with a community of disability rights advocates, gave me purpose and direction, and taught me that ordinary people can prevail against seemingly powerful institutions when the law is on their side. The fireplace that started this entire conflict burns cheerfully on cold evenings, a symbol of both my medical needs and my hard-won rights. Every time I light a fire, I remember the struggle it took to secure that simple accommodation and feel gratitude for the legal protections that made victory possible. And I think about other disabled residents facing discrimination from housing providers, hoping that my case makes their fights a little easier and their outcomes more certain. Sharon learned an expensive lesson about the limits of HOA authority and the importance of respecting federal civil rights laws. The Cedar Ridge Estates community learned about the costs of allowing authoritarian leadership to go unchecked. And I learned that standing up for your rights, even when the opposition seems overwhelming, is always worth the effort. These lessons continue to resonate years later, shaping how I live my life and how I engage with my community. The story of my battle with the Cedar Ridge Estates, HOA, is ultimately a story about justice, perseverance, and the power of civil rights laws to protect vulnerable individuals from discrimination. It is a story I am proud to tell, and one that I hope inspires others facing similar challenges to stand firm in defense of their rights.